And the McLafferty reporting. Let's get a word with my guests of the day. Suzanne Breen and Chris Donnelly are with me. Suzanne, first of all, any surprise in that result in your view?
There was no surprise, but the annoying thing for journalists and perhaps for the public is that we don't know the margin of Michelle O'Neill's victory. We had no debate, public debate certainly, during the leadership contest. There were no hustings, there were no media head-to-heads. And when John O'Dowd threw his hat into the ring for the Vice President position, he said that he wanted a public debate about the party and about the future of republicanism. That didn't happen. And while we know that in 2015, Colm Eastwood got 172 votes to Alistair MacDonald's 133 when they contested the SDLP leadership, we know what Alistair MacDonald in turn won by 4 years earlier when he beat 3 other SDLP candidates. We are totally in the dark about what happened in Sinn Féin.
Chris, I wonder how damaging you think that is. All the democratic markers you'd expect to see in a contest like this were absent. Kevin Doyle in the Sunday Independent today says it felt a bit like a cup final without a ball or even the need for a referee.
I think it is certainly something that Sinn Féin is going to have to change. I think Enda noted in his report that there was a motion passed. I think looking at internally reviewing how leadership contests are going to have to be changed in the future. I think one thing is very clear. I mean, John O'Dowd's stature and leadership credentials within Sinn Féin, both in terms of its activist-based and I think in terms of its voter-based, will have been enhanced by the fact that he was the person that triggered this, which is really a challenge to the political culture of Sinn Féin. It's something that is long past due. You know, this is necessary. You know, political parties in Western democracies thrive and survive because they allow for internal tensions. They have to have those discussions and they have to be open. And the way he conducted himself, he didn't, I mean, Suzanne is right. All of those internal markers of having hustings and the open discussions, clearly he adhered to regulations that he would not have otherwise wanted to because he realised, look, he's trying to change a party here and that's going to take time.
And what now for John O'Dowd, do you think? Will he be welcomed back into the fold?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, watching at the Millennium Forum in Derry when Mary Lou and Michelle O'Neill were on stage and John O'Dowd was seated up in the gods, it actually looked like that he had been banished to political Siberia. So he was very welcoming of Michelle O'Neill's win. He was very respectful. He tweeted that out. But he's the Sinn Féin candidate for Upper Ban in 4 weeks' time. He really can't do anything but that. But the big question here is, what does Sinn Féin do with John O'Dowd? He is their most experienced and competent performer in Stormont. He deserves a ministerial position. If the power-sharing executive is restored, will he get it?
That's a big question. And there is some talk, Chris, about the party perhaps splitting the roles of vice presidency and assembly leader.
Yeah, I think that's something that probably would make sense. I think that, you know, in the event of Stormont coming back, it remains to be seen, would John O'Dowd be given that? I don't know. Conor Murphy's name would probably be in the fray as well. So we'll have to see what happens. But I do not think that John O'Dowd, the party cannot afford to alienate or isolate John O'Dowd. He's too big a figure. He's too much a positive for Sinn Féin, regardless of what threat certain individuals might see him posing with regard to potential leadership contests in the future.
OK, thanks both. We'll catch up with you again shortly. Well, that's very interesting on a number of fronts. First of all, on the issue of whether or not an Irish Language Act should be a red line. Clear green water between Aontú and Sinn Féin.
Yeah, I think that was particularly interesting. I think Potter's got that wrong in terms of reading the Nationalist Republican constituency in the north. I think the most significant element of Aontú's arrival into the north is that socially conservative Nationalists and Republicans have a voting option, an electoral option that previously might not have been there for them, given how political positions Sinn Féin and SDLP have adopted over issues in the last 6 months. But it's very clear that on certain issues, and we've seen this why the party are not running for Manor South Throne in North Belfast, because they are reading the mood of nationalism. I think in terms of the Irish Language Act, I think if he was closer to the sentiment of nationalists, I think that's a position that might end up having to be revised.
Suzanne, what do you make of the claim there from the party leader that the Aontú candidate in Foyle could win that seat? I mean, none of us have a crystal ball, but realistically?
None of us have a crystal ball, but Dr. Anne McCluskey has polled very strongly, not just in the council elections, but in the assembly elections. I don't think she's going to win the seat, but the key will be who she takes the most votes from. Will it be from Colm Eastwood or will it be from Alicia McCallion? my sources in Derry would tell me that in urban areas, she'll probably hurt the SDLP more. And in the rural parts of the constituency, people sometimes forget and think that it's just Derry City itself. But in the rural parts of the constituency, she will hurt Sinn Féin. Elsewhere, I don't know how strongly that Into are going to perform. I think Patter's problem is that while he is a massively articulate and talented person, as he was in Sinn Féin, is he really going to be able to build a party? And without like the likes of Anne McCluskey, is he just going to really get people who haven't made it in other parties?
Chris, what about Foyle?
This isn't about Anne McCluskey winning a seat, winning the Westminster seat.
Although he says it is.
He's going to say that he's the party leader. He's not going to abandon his own candidates. But what this is about for Patter and for Aintu is Anne McCluskey represents the party's best hope of getting into the Assembly. So therefore, talking up her prospects, keeping her profile up at this moment in time, is about keeping her relevant to the conversation with that Assembly election pending possibly within a number of months.
And just to clarify, at the beginning of the interview, we talked about which was more important to Aintu, its constitutional position or its pro-life position. And again, it was clear it is about the constitutional issue first and foremost.
I think it's both, and that perhaps is the problem. I mean, we talk as well about Aintu being very socially conservative. It's actually very economically radical. It's a strange mix. I don't know how much the pro-life spirit of the party really does go down generally across the whole Northern Ireland election. Are people going to vote or not vote for Sinn Féin based on the party's views on abortion? I think even pro-life people will very reluctantly continue to vote for Sinn Féin.
There's an interesting thing happening here, and we touched on it during the interview, that Aintu won't run where a Republican could lose out to a Unionist, but will run in safe nationalist seats. What's the rationale behind that?
I think it's very clear from their own perspective that doors will be closed to them if they're seen to be limiting the prospects of nationalists, whether it's in Fermanagh, South Tyrone or North Belfast, taking a seat in a straight contest with the Unionists, whereas in West Belfast or Newry, Armagh or Foyle, which are overwhelmingly nationalist constituencies, I think they have more of a prospect of getting an ear at the door and perhaps growing support.
Final thoughts, Suzanne?
I think Aintu did want to stand in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, but there was a lot of pressure perhaps put on the ground to the local candidates. So I think Patter's right in that regard. OK, we'll leave it there. Thanks both very much indeed. We'll hear from you at the end of the programme. It's just time for a few final thoughts from my guests of the day. Suzanne, it is looking very tight at Westminster. Even after another election, do you think the DUP might still be in a position of considerable influence come Friday the 13th of December? I think it's highly likely, but wouldn't it be funny if the SDLP got 2 MPs elected and they ended up holding the balance of power? The result of this election has to be bad for the DUP, because either Boris Johnson, as the pundits are predicting, is going to get a majority and he's going to fire on ahead with his Brexit bill, or else we're going to have Jeremy Corbyn, the bête noire of Unionists, the friend of Sinn Féin's, in power. So unless the very unlikely event that the arithmetic is going to be very similar to what it is before, then Unionists are in trouble. Yeah,
that arithmetic is fascinating. And again, none of us have a crystal ball here to take advantage of. But it could go one way, it could go a very, very different way altogether. And we just don't know at this stage.
We don't, Mark, but and the polling, the history of polling over recent elections and even the Brexit referendum leads many people to be sceptical about what we're hearing in successive polls. I will say that I think the most significant development perhaps in the last week was in terms of Nigel Farage pulling out in 300 plus constituencies. I think that will help in first past the post. It is so important just to obviously to be out on top. And I think that is going to feed the narrative that the Conservative Party alone are going to be the attractive option for Brexit voters across England and Wales. And I think that from Labour, yes, I think that was a good development, Jeremy Corbyn getting the broadband story out, planting that seed this week, ahead of the manifesto launch next week, when they would hope to get a number of their other positive policy platform issues out in the public. I think at this moment it's too close to call, really.
Yeah, but here in Northern Ireland, it isn't about those policy issues. I mean, normally during an election campaign, that's what we're talking about in great detail. Those issues seem pretty irrelevant at this stage in the campaign, Suzanne.
Yeah, well, we just turned it again into another big sectarian headcount. We can see that in North Belfast, we can see that in Fermanagh and South Tyrone, and most of the debate has centred so far around pacts and who's standing where and why have certain parties stepped aside? And that, and as opposed to policy issues, is what's the focus of our election. I totally agree with Chris when he says that it is too close to call in Britain. And I think while Labour have some fabulous policies, and the broadband one was very, very innovative, they are in a total and absolute mess on Brexit.